Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. It is 6 p.m. India time on the 5th of November, and it is almost certain that President Trump will lose the presidential elections in the United States and that there will be a Biden administration in Washington, D.C. in January 2021. What does that mean for India, given that the current Indian government had invested perhaps a bit too much in the Trump administration, breaking away from the traditional non-partisan approach? How will the Biden administration deal with New Delhi? Or have Indo-US ties become so institutionalized today that a change of administration would not have any impact at all? More so, will the Biden administration continue to consider India to be a major strategic partner in its new Indo-Pacific strategy aimed at balancing China? To discuss these questions, I have with me Ambassador Nirupama Menon and Max Rodenbeck. Ambassador Rao was India's foreign secretary and was India's ambassador to China and the United States. Max Rodenbeck is the South Asia bureau chief of the Economist magazine. Welcome to the National Security Conversation, Ambassador Rao and Max Rodenbeck. This discussion, for the most part, and my questions are based on the assumption that President Trump is perhaps losing the election and that there will be a Biden administration in the United States in January 2021. Ambassador Menon, let me begin with you. To begin with, is this a correct assumption to make at this point of time of the day? And how do you, from an Indian point of view, even India's ambassador to the United States, view the Biden administration as compared to the Trump administration?
Thank you, Happy, for having me on the show. This America that you witnessed today during this election campaign and the events that are unfolding at the moment is a very rather different America that from what I saw when I left my post as ambassador in 2013. I think what you see is a very polarized, divided America. And there is one segment of the population, a good proportion of it, that believes in Trumpism and everything that it has brought in its wake. And another segment that believes, in what the Democratic Party has been campaigning about bringing back stability, replacing the chaos of the last few years, dealing better with the pandemic, and restoring America's image in the world, because the impression a lot of us share across the globe is that America has been in retrenchment of some sort in the last few years. So if a Biden administration comes to power, and although the trending lines would indicate that Mr. Biden is well positioned to win the election, but it may be quite a close call. And what would happen if it's a close call is the worst case scenario, because Mr. Trump, not only is he going to rattle the cage, but he's going to go down fighting. And already you see a string of legal petitions that have been launched by the Republican Party, over 40, I believe, apart from, the 3 that he intends to go forward with at this moment, to question the very basis of what the world would assume are the sine qua non of a democratically held election. You have to count all the ballots. You have to make sure that, the one person, one vote right of every citizen who's eligible to vote is respected. And that seems to be questioned. So, we all have heard of Russian roulette, but now it seems to be American roulette that is being played out. And the world is, watching with concern. Is American decline going to be cemented further as a result? Because Mr. Trump seems to care for his own future and not so much about the country's future, as it were. So, US domestic risk, as somebody said, is fast going to become a global risk.
Right. Max, can I have your thoughts on that? Where are we as far as the elections are concerned? Is it going to be a Biden administration? And how do you, sitting at this point of time in New Delhi, view this from a point of view, as it were?
Well, I think, I mean, this is one of these, another confused election. The last several elections in America have been, confused in a way that would not happen in a country under a different kind of electoral system. But I think it's pretty clear that it's a Biden who's pulled ahead. And I mean, even if you can't count the the voting numbers, if you follow the international betting sites where the money talks, it's about 90%, Biden at this point. And it really does look like it will be Biden, and it's a matter of by how much. It seems pretty clear that even if it's Biden, it's going to be Biden by a very small amount. It was a really close election. It defied the polls again. I mean, Trump almost pulled it off like he did the last time in 2016. Very close. I mean, a lot of these races are within, a tiny fraction of the, 1% one way or another, these crucial battleground states. So that actually, and that has implications for a Biden administration. Because it's not just with the presidential result that it's not a resounding victory for Biden, but it's also that it looks like the Republicans have probably retained control of the Senate. So that means that it's going to be difficult under a Biden administration to pass new legislation. And it looks like that this, although the Democrats do control the lower house of the American legislature, the House of Representatives, the Republican control of the Senate in a mood and in an atmosphere of complete polarization doesn't look good for the ability of a Biden administration to pass, a lot of legislation. I mean, it's going to be a difficult task. It's useful in that sense that Biden himself has a long career in the Senate and knows how it works and how to deal with other, with senators and so on. He may be better able to, negotiate his way through things than Trump was, for example, who had no experience in Washington at all before coming to power. So I think we're pretty clearly going to have a Biden administration. Part of what they're going to try and do, I presume, top of the agenda is to repair some of the damage done under Trump to the actual institutions in America. I mean, to Washington itself, how things function, to the different departments and so on. For example, the Department of State, American foreign policy, America's foreign ministry was pretty much gutted under Trump. That has to be put together again. So I think that's going to be a very important part of the Biden agenda, is trying to sort of put the executive powers back into more as they were before Trump came along with a sort of wrecking ball, as CNN is fond of characterizing his rule as. So that's going to be a major thing on the Biden agenda, I think it's going to be interesting to watch. But I mean, it's important to note that this isn't, as I said, it's not a resounding victory for the Democrats, and you still have a very divided America. It will be, I personally believe, helpful to sort of dialogue inside America between Americans, that Trump is no longer there as a sort of, an exacerbator of problems and difficulties, and a kind of, a person there to deepen any divisions that exist, which seems to have been his role that he rather gleefully played, because it always puts him at center. So to remove Trump from the equation is going to be have a calming effect, I would hope, on the American body politic. That's what we might wish for.
Ambassador Menon, it is sort of widely argued that it doesn't really make much of a difference for India who comes to power in the United States. There is a great deal of bipartisan support in Washington, D.C. For India. How accurate is that? And what are the sources of this support for a strong U.S.-India relations in DC at this point of time?
Well, it's certainly true to define US-India relations as being defined, as being helped along by a bipartisan consensus that exists in both the houses of Congress, in the Senate and the House of Representatives. I think a lot of that is helped along by the fact that this has been a stable relationship for the last 2 decades at least. And within Congress, helped along by the support from the very influential and prosperous Indian American diaspora, who are connected to their representatives in the legislatures. That has certainly helped, this kind of symbiosis between the diaspora and the representatives of the people. And many Indian Americans, as you know, have contributed vastly and quite substantially to both the campaigns. I was just reading today that to the Biden campaign alone, there are more than 10 Indian Americans who have contributed over $100,000 to the campaign. And so this is certainly one factor. The second factor, because of the bipartisan consensus, whatever administration you've seen in power in Washington since the early 2000s has had a perspective on India that here is the world's largest democracy. India and America are essentially meant to be natural allies, the term that Prime Minister Vajpayee used first. And that thirdly, with the rise of China and the growing competition and the decoupling that you're seeing between the US and China, that India is America's new best friend in the region. So that has also been a defining characteristic of this relationship. Now, what would happen if a Biden administration is in power in Washington? I think that consensus and that foundational stability that has helped this relationship will assist it to grow further. I don't think there are any fundamental dissonances between the Democrats and the Republicans as far as India is concerned. People speak of the Biden Democrats as being a little more, having a critique, let's say, on certain policies of the government of India today, whether it's Kashmir, or, when it comes to Pakistan, Mr. Biden, as Max mentioned, has been a long-standing member of the Senate. He's chaired the Foreign Relations Committee. He's dealt a lot with Pakistan, as he has with India. So he is, I'm sure, going to see himself as a foreign policy president as much as a president who's going to set America right again and make it really great again. In terms of its domestic, situation. So by and large, I'd say the India-US relationship is in a good place going forward. I believe in the Trump years, you saw a certain narrowing of the arteries. There's a lot of emphasis on defense and security, perhaps less emphasis on trade. For instance, you had difficulties, not insurmountable, but certainly very transactional. And the other aspects of the relationship, we've always said that this relationship embraces every field of human endeavor. But when you look back at the Trump years, was that really the defining characteristic of the relationship? But on the defense and security side, with the emergence of the Indo-Pacific as an overarching strategic definition for geopolitics in our region, I believe we made a lot of progress in the Trump years also. And then you had also had this kind of bonhomie and this very organic rapport between Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi that seemed to sort of give more buoyancy to the relationship.
But that was there during Obama's
absolutely,
presidency.
It was there with Mr. Obama
Bush,
also.
Manmohan.
So it's it doesn't stop a good relationship with Mr. Biden.
Right, but let me ask that question more provocatively. Is a Biden presidency better for India than a Trump presidency?
Well, if you're looking at it from, the indices being respect for institutions, improving institutions like the State Department, which was absolutely decimated, I think, during the Trump years. You'll have more hands on board as far as this relationship is concerned. You'll have more, even when it comes to confronting China. Now, when you listen to Secretary Pompeo, especially Secretary Pompeo, or you listen to Secretary Esper, the whole China relationship was posited and defined in such a dialectical Manichaean sort of manner, good versus bad, black versus white. And there was no room for diplomatic nuance or, any space, any middle ground as far as dealing with China was concerned. I'm sure the Biden administration, which will have many hands on board who have dealt with China, who are China specialists, who will take a more mature view of this whole relationship vis-a-vis China. And I think that will help India too, because, America first is all very well. Within America, that resonates. But America first in our region, what does that mean for us? I think everybody should have a voice. And we've always spoken about multipolarity, balanced multipolarity. And I think the Biden administration will, in a sense, be open to that kind of multipolarity, rather than having this very sharp, angular contradiction, sacrificing everything on the altar of contradiction with China.
Right. Max, would it be accurate to say that given the ideology of the ruling party in India, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the government in New Delhi found it easier to deal with the conservatives in Washington, D.C., who do not normally come with an excessive amount of human rights baggage, for example? Or do you rule out any ideological connection, as it were, at all?
I think I wouldn't overestimate the importance of an ideological affinity. I mean, certainly, I mean, both parties, the Republicans in the US and the BJP in Egypt, in India, would define themselves as sort of conservative parties. And there's a kind of affinity there. And there's certainly, in some of the BJP's institutional supporters in the United States, there's a Republican leaning. And there was an opportunity which Prime Minister Modi grasped to sort of push that connection a little bit. I mean, of course, in his meeting in Houston, the big Howdy Modi sort of pageant in Houston was the obvious big expression of that. And one might think that considering that it's likely to be a Biden administration that comes in, that some people might say it was a terrible mistake on India's part to throw all its eggs in one basket. To have the Prime Minister stand up and say, "Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar," when it turns out not to be Trump Sarkar. But I don't think so. I think it's understood in Washington that that Trump was the kind of leader who's very susceptible to personal flattery, and that, Mr. Modi was simply doing his job by pushing that kind of connection to India's advantage. There's nothing, I mean, so I don't think that India will lose points in any sense by having tried to, push for some kind of special connection with the Trump administration. That's just, realpolitik, really. But still, there are some lessons to be drawn there for how far out you can go at playing another country's politics. So that is true also. But I don't think also. I mean, there's such a. I think to the degree that Washington and the United States sort of foreign policy establishment thinks about India at all, which frankly is not very much, largely by a sort of fairly specialist bunch of people. They are not too. There's a considerable consensus between, as Ambassador Menon was saying, there's a considerable consensus between both parties in the U.S. about where America would like to see its relationship with India go. And in fact, you can see there's been a trajectory over the last 20, 30 years, which is consistent, and it's in the same way that there's been a kind of trajectory in New Delhi about, how to deal with America, which is fairly consistent in the last 20 years. I mean, it's towards a kind of convergence of interests, sometimes propelled by other actors, such as China. What does China do? Obviously, China having a harder relationship with India opens up possibilities for a stronger Indian-American relationship. This seems to be a kind of natural sort of fact of nature, so to speak. But I don't see any great change on in this relationship. And as Ambassador Menon said, it may, on a kind of institutional basis, become a bit easier, simply because Trump himself was such a disruptive factor. You never knew which way he was going to turn. I mean, he was on one day he was Prime Minister Modi's best friend. The next day he was calling India filthy. So what kind of friend is that? So I think a little bit of a slightly more even keel, and perhaps even not even speaking about India for a while, might be welcome from Washington. And for someone like Biden, I think we're less likely by far to hear, gaffes and, disturbing pronouncements and have major radical shifts of policy.
I agree with both of you that there is a certain, I think, institutional arrangement between India and the United States on the issue of defense, national security, etc., etc. But I think there could be differences on political issues. Say, for example, on the Kashmir question, the incoming Vice President Kamala Harris did make a statement. In fact, more than one statement about Kashmir and human rights situation in Jammu and Kashmir. There could be in the years to come more articulate pronouncements from the United States on communal issues within India. Do you see these rather political issues becoming a problem for Indo-US relations, Max?
Potentially. I mean, there are different wings of the Democratic Party, and there are different ways that the Democrats may deal with things. Certainly, traditionally speaking, Democrats in power in Washington have been more attuned and to questions of international rights issues, human rights, and so on and so forth. Adherence of parties to international law and so on. Less likely to just give sovereignty to countries and let them go. I don't think we've had any Democrat who's ever described a foreign leader as my favorite dictator, which is what President Trump said about Egypt's leader, for example. And yes, perhaps there will be a bit more criticism directed against India. But for one thing, I think India should be prepared to meet that criticism, and this is not something that should worry India. India is capable of responding to that sort of criticism. It can respond either diplomatically or it can change its behavior. But I don't think the Americans are going to necessarily do anything about such criticism. So the fundamentals of the relationship will remain the same. So yes, perhaps there may be some bones of contention with this particular Indian government over some issues of human rights. That's quite possible, but I don't think it will, stand in the way of a deepening of the Indian-American relationship. I mean, it's a relationship that's built on, it's not just mutual interests in terms of China, for example, but there's a human relationship that's very, very important. I mean, and an economic relationship that's crucial to India, for example. Considering that the Indian software offshoring industry is very, very largely reliant on business from the United States, and the sort of human back and forth traffic between the US and India is immense. So this is all very important, and these are underlying factors which are, they are not vulnerable to fluctuations over some, condemnation in the United Nations or some such, forum of Indian behavior. I don't think it could. It's not likely to undermine the relationship to any serious degree.
Right, Ambassador Menon, one of the things that the Indian government, in particular, and Indians in general, are touchy about is the critical statements emanating from foreign countries on the situation domestically, be it Kashmir or other issues. And as a matter of fact, after the Kashmir decision in 2019 August, the government of India did say on several occasions that the international community is not concerned about what's happening. It's just the Pakistanis who are making a lot of noise about it. So basically meaning that we are concerned about what the other countries are thinking or saying about what happens internally. So is there a possibility that the democratic government, democratic administration in the United States will be more proactive in sort of issuing such pronouncements, and how much will that bother the Indian government or affect the relationship between India and the United States negatively?
I think as far as relations between friends are concerned, I mean, even in normal life, you should be prepared to also countenance that there will be disagreements on some issues. But that overall, you keep the interests of the friendship in mind. You have shared values. You have common strategic interests. We call it convergence today. I think that convergence will continue despite the fact that you may, as you said, have more vocal positions emanating from the Biden administration on issues like Kashmir or interreligious, intercommunal relations. You should be prepared for that. But the question is this going to change the fundamental direction of this relationship? I don't believe it will. And if you recall, even after the Article 370 issue came up last year in August, and the Pakistanis conspired, let's say, with the Chinese to bring the issue before the Security Council. you had support from the Americans and basically from the other members of the council, apart from China, to see that issue didn't take off. That it died a natural death before it came up for discussion. Now, I can expect that if such a move came up once again, I believe the Biden administration would take a similar position to what the Trump administration took. So I'm saying in terms of the fundamental precepts of this relationship and the convergence that you see on strategic issues, there will not be a change, whether it comes to counterterrorism, whether it comes to a rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific, whether it comes to a community of like-minded democracies, creating a coalition of interests when it comes to dealing with a China that is not prepared to subscribe to such a rule-based order is concerned. So as far as the relationship is concerned, I think, as far as India is concerned, we would like, when Mr. Biden, presuming he becomes president, when he's able to turn his attention away from domestic issues, to look at, and immigration being one of them, how it affects skilled workers coming from India. We'd like more inclusiveness and more accommodation on that position. Similarly, on trade, less transactionalism. I hope the GSP can be restored, even though it may not have made much of a difference as far as the overall volume of trade in goods and services was concerned. And similarly on public health, multilateralism, I think that is so important for India. And it was so not important for the Trump administration. And if you go with a wrecking ball, which was Mr. Trump's usual style, to destroy global institutions, I think all of us are affected by that, particularly in issues like global health. On the issue of the pandemic, you need much more global cooperation. You can't go it alone, definitely.
Right, Ambassador Menon, let me ask you a follow-up question on that. I mean, it's all good to talk about natural allies, about the democracies. There are common values, etc. But what really fundamentally are the U.S. interests in courting New Delhi? Is it economic? Is it strategic? Is it to push back China? What really is it? At the bottom of it all, what really would the United States of America want from India?
I think it's a fundamental realignment in the last 70 years. If you look at this relationship, for the first 5 decades, we were essentially, there were periods of very visible estrangement between our two democracies. There were periods when we came together, maybe during the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, a little bit of sunshine during the Reagan years, perhaps. And then, Bill Clinton in a period when relations had sunk to a low with the imposition of US sanctions against India after our nuclear tests of 1998, Mr. Clinton opened the door to the future, as it were. And then from then on, you had a Republican administration of George W. Bush, succeeded by Mr. Obama and then by Trump, everybody building on this relationship. And yes, the issues that you mentioned, whether it's shared values, democracy, resisting China, the market, Indian market, all these must have, and a sense of confidence that India had the promise, had the potential to be that power in the region that could ultimately provide the best balance in a very asymmetrical situation engendered by the rise of China. Definitely all these factors.
Max, what do you think about that? 2005, 6, 7 is not 2020. Things have changed a lot. India's economic performance has dwindled. So what is it that India can perhaps offer to the United States, and what is it that the United States is looking for from India? And the fact that India's economic performance has dwindled so much, will that affect the relationship between India and the United States?
Well, I think there are several parts to that question. I mean, one of them is the sort of geostrategic picture part of the question, which is, in a broad, long-term sense, America has been sort of withdrawing from the world, or at least, it's unable to play the same role that it did 20, 30 years ago as a sort of global policeman, hegemon, as the enemies of America would call the United States. There's a of that in America, and as a result, the Americans have been looking for sort of partners to, fill the vacuum in different parts of the globe as America kind of, withdraws more to its core interests rather than be able to project itself everywhere. And India, in the view from Washington, fills a very, very important part of that potential world map of who is a friendly power that is in favor of the rule of law, that can promote stability within a region, and India is very well placed to sort of play that role. So I think there's a very long-term interest by the Americans in India being strong, independent, and being able to play this role as a friendly power, which is actually a regional power and able to exercise a kind of positive influence within its sphere and in its region. So I think that's very significant on one part. But I mean, there's another part to the question which is purely economic. I mean, what does India mean, the Indian market? And I think there's also a sense of India, at least in the last 10 years, has been relatively disappointing compared to the previous 2 decades, when there was a sort of there was a sense that India is coming onto the world stage, economically speaking, in a way that got a lot of international companies, economists, various people very excited. That excitement is worn off. The sheen is worn off, especially in the last few years, as the Indian economy has slowed down. But there's still the sense that there's a potential there. I mean, if you look at what has happened to, what some people might call the American empire, since World War II, what has really proved to be in the American interest has been the prosperity of its allies, the prosperity of all of its friends and allies. That is what, sort of, the longer term, soft power of the United States has been built on. It's been the success of countries like Germany and Japan, the success of Europe, as a project, economically speaking, the success of Southeast Asia as a project, economically speaking, which kind of falls under the American, security umbrella and is largely based on actually exports to America. There's a kind of mutually beneficial thing that happens with a prospering economy. So I think that, the Americans, in a very broad sense, are interested in seeing India succeed economically and grow economically and become a place that is part linked into the international supply chain to a larger extent than it is at present, but also as a place that trades much more freely with America, both imports, exports, both ways, And, the integration, for example, in, software and online services between the US and India, which is already pretty impressive, I think would be the kind of model for what, American businesses and so on would like to see in the future, more widely across many different fields. I mean, it's interesting, for example, that India has become a big importer of American oil, American fuel. That's not something that was on the cards at all 10 years ago, and now that's an important part of the mix in the relationship. So I think Indian prosperity is high up there on what would be good for America. What's good for India is good for America, basically.
Max, I mean, I have a follow-up question. I mean, Ambassador Menon did mention about U.S. approach to multilateralism. I mean, to begin with, I think a Biden administration will have to do a lot of work at home domestically, given how the political divisions within America are deepening. And they have a lot of, housekeeping work to do within the United States. But the question is, what is the future of multilateralism under a Biden administration? Will the United States return to multilateralism? What will be the American, what is going to be the extent of American commitment to climate change, arms control, UN? What's the sort of big picture view that you have at this point of time about America's role in the world in terms of vis-a-vis multilateralism?
Multilaterally speaking, I think there would certainly almost unquestionably be a renewed commitment to a lot of multinational institutions and protocols that President Trump seemed determined to undermine and wreak as much destruction as possible, often to self-harm. I would say in many cases, he seemed to be determined to undo whatever international agreements that Obama had ever made, just as a matter of principle. Without really looking too closely into whether those agreements were good for the United States or not. And I think that may be put into fairly strong reverse. I mean, it's important in this regard to recognize that an American president has rather carefully delineated powers. I mean, doesn't have the full powers to do as much as an American president would like. In some ways has less powers than, for example, an Indian prime minister in some ways. And one of the things that Trump did and that characterized his term in office was that he arrived in office not knowing what the job was really, and spent a lot of the job figuring out how far he could go in every direction, what buttons he could push. And it turns out that there's some things, for example, immigration, some foreign affairs issues, where the president does have a lot of power. Other things, he does not have that much power. But I mean, some of those things he does have power on. So there is executive power that can push towards some of these things. And I would imagine that a Biden administration will be very likely to rejoin the Paris Climate Control Agreement, which America just formally exited, I think, yesterday, which is kind of strange. But the climate control agreement, it's likely to come back. That's very high on the Democratic Party's agenda, is the whole environmental issue and global warming. That is very likely to come back. And I think you'll find America trying to pursue things like arms control deals with the Soviet Union, with Russia. It'll be less likely just to simply tear things up for the pleasure of tearing them up than Trump seemed to. So I think you'll find the Americans are more likely to behave as kind of international citizens and be looking towards building coalitions and working with other countries rather than this, the sort of John Wayne style Western, where you go it alone against all the bandits.
Right. Ambassador Menon, what is clear is that there will be some undoing of Trump's foreign policy by the Biden administration. As you pointed out earlier on, Biden is a foreign policy hand in many ways. So you've been ambassador to United States. You also been ambassador to China. So what do you think is going to be Biden's China policy in some ways? Is it going to be that he's going to take a step back and review the situation, or the path that Mr. Trump has taken, which is an aggressive path towards China, is that going to be the case from here on? Well, I'm asking this question because the way I'm looking at it, our government has taken the American policy towards China and Indo-Pacific pretty seriously and have in many ways decided to follow suit. Now, tomorrow, if there is a change of heart in Washington, we are probably going to be left in the lurch. How do you sort of view that?
Well, as I said before, I believe that the Biden administration, they will have much more respect for institutions, much more of a professional foreign policy establishment, let's say. And that is also going to, the impact of that will, I believe, be seen on a number of key hot button foreign policy issues, including China. I think, with Mr. Trump, he had very serious impulse control issues, I think. There was a lot of megaphone diplomacy when it came to China and many other situations worldwide. So you will see less of that. But when it comes to China policy being a bipartisan consensus-related issue in the United States today, that is very much a reality. I think on both sides of the political spectrum, there is a realization that China policy has to be fundamentally reoriented, perhaps redefined, as it were. And the kind of coupling and the kind of close sort of interaction and involvement that you saw with China on the part of the United States from 1978, 1979 onwards, that chapter has closed. That phase has ended. It is, in a sense, as Orville Schell said recently, an end of engagement, and a death of engagement, let's say. Now, to what extent, they can resurrect that policy from its, near moribund state, I mean, those policy approaches. So there will be redefining, there will be reorientation, but I think there will be less of this kind of high decibel rhetoric when it comes to China. There will be attempts to dialogue on issues like climate change or even global public health, That's not, that I think will change. It will be cooperation in certain areas, but continued confrontation in other areas. Trade, technology, essentially, as Parag Khanna said the other day, you're seeing the coming up of a technology wall, like the Berlin Wall, across the world today. And where do countries like we fit in is the question. Where does India fit in? You know, we have our challenges on 5G, for instance, today. So technology and the divisions on technology, the polarization that has already begun, will be sustained. That will not go away. So the China policy of the Biden administration cannot just be, you know, switching on, switching off. You know, we can resume where President Obama left off. That is not going to be the situation.
Right, Max. You know, looking at the regional security architecture, as it were, or the lack of it. You know, India is sort of situated in a delicate geostrategic location. I mean, you have China on the one hand, you have Pakistan on the other. You have a ganging up of China, Pakistan, and Iran. And thanks to Trump's policy towards Iran, you also have the Iranians breaking up with India and going into the fold with the Russians, Pakistanis, and perhaps even the Chinese. So, what Biden does towards the region, vis-a-vis the region, will have a lot of impact on India from a geostrategic point of view. So, given that and keeping that in mind, do you think Biden administration will go back to Obama administration's policy towards Iran, and what implications they might have in the region?
I don't think so necessarily. I mean, the thing is that you know, I think you know, in regard to Iran in particular, the Obama administration invested a tremendous amount of energy and probably overdid it trying to just reach this one nuclear deal with Iran, you know, which was then immediately undermined by the Trump administration. But things have moved on. I mean, the whole, you know, scene has moved on. I think you can't recreate that moment. You know, there may be slightly more desire on the American side to not necessarily be in full-on confrontation with Iran all the time. But I don't think this means that there will be a sudden, you know, coziness between the US and Iran. And particularly as one of the things that's moved on is that Iran has drifted more into, as you're suggesting, a sort of closer embrace of China. And there seems to be a kind of coalescing of a, you know, different shaped world across the, you know, region, very broadly speaking. I mean, you know, Russia is closer to China than it was before. Russia is closer to Pakistan than it has ever been. You know, Iran is now closer to China. There seems to be the coalescing of some new kind of shaped thing. It hasn't turned into anything very, very obvious, but obviously this does have implications for India. I think in this circumstances, the United States is not going to abandon its, you know, whatever policies it's built up under Trump. And as Ambassador Menon said, for example, one of the things is China. There's very strong sort of bipartisan consensus, broad consensus across the whole American sort of policy establishment, in fact, that yes, China had too easy a ride from the West in general for years. And so, you know, the idea that it's time to get tough with China is very much, you know, an idea that has very, very broad acceptance. And I don't think that's certainly not going to change under a Biden administration. What that actually has to do with the specifics of, you know, more close focused changes closer to India's borders, for example, will America suddenly become closer to Pakistan? Will the Biden administration change the you know, plans for America to withdraw from Afghanistan? I don't think so, actually. I don't think so. I don't think this doesn't come very high on the American strategic agenda, for one thing, of what to do next. But I don't think there's any sense in Washington that there's any need to change course on that. You know, what is the value added for suddenly becoming friendly with Iran? Hard to see what that might be. What is any value added for the United States in changing course with Pakistan, particularly when Pakistan hasn't changed? I don't see any reason for movement on that. I think the tricky thing will be how the United States deals with Afghanistan and getting out of Afghanistan. That was going to be tricky under any administration, and it's going to be awkward and clumsy and not a very pretty picture to look at under a Biden administration as much as it was under a Trump administration.
Pastor Rao, this is my final question. With that, we will end the show. There was a time when America was not really, popular in the strategic circles in India. It was not really non-kosher to have. It was not really very kosher to have that close defense partnership with the United States of America. Things have changed today. We just signed another foundational defense agreement with the United States. And yet there is not one criticism coming from any quarter. What has changed? What explains this sudden warmth in the Indian strategic community towards the United States of America?
I think it has a lot to do with also the current crisis that we face in our relations with China. The confrontation along the line of actual control and the visible, palpable deterioration in the climate of relations with China and the situation of near conflict that, full-blown conflict that we are facing with that country. So the general consensus, I think, in the strategic community has been, perhaps as a result of this, and also a sense of a sort of comfort level in the US-India relationship having steadily improved over the last few years. That combination of factors perhaps has resulted in a general conclusion and a consensus that India has perhaps no alternative at the moment but to consider a much closer, more convivial relationship with the United States and a recognition of the strategic convergences between the two countries. And that's why when Becca was signed, as you said, there was very little criticism, maybe a very sotto voce here or there saying, we've essentially hitched our wagon to the American star, that we are virtually allies, even if we don't call ourselves allies. We're not allies, and neither is America seeking an alliance with us. Maybe it's a much closer, much more pronounced alignment of interests between America and India in this region, with the focus on the maritime environment, the recrudescence of the Quad and everything that is associated with. But don't forget don't forget Japan and Australia and many other countries in the region with which we have a good, healthy, ongoing interaction, like Vietnam or with the ASEAN countries, or in our own off the west coast of Africa. All these things have come together, but I believe that the relationship with the United States, the close relationship with the United States, is going to underpin a lot of this.
Great conversation. Wonderful talking to both of you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.